Well, as you all know, our next speaker is Dr. Tom DiLorenzo. Tom is a professor of economics at Loyola University in Maryland, a senior fellow of the Institute, the author of 14 books. Most recently, Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government, that just arrived today at the Institute. And it is for this book that the Institute is about to award the Cowther Prize to Tom DiLorenzo. George Cowther, who died, was a speechwriter for the top CEOs of American corporations, did television work, had a fascinating career, but always at his heart was Misesian economics and good writing, and what an extraordinary writer he was. And so after his death, his family endowed a George Cowther Free Market Writing Award for some extraordinary book that had been published recently. And the
overheads I was going to show. But anyway, where to start? Let me give you a couple of reading suggestions. There's a sort of a classic article on the Austrian view of competition and monopoly. It's called The Meaning of Competition by Hayek. It's in his book, Individualism and Economic Order. Also read the chapter entitled The Market and Human Action. And then, of course, there's the chapter on monopoly and competition in Man, Economy, and State. And a final thing I would recommend if you really want to get up to speed in the Austrian view of competition is Competition and Entrepreneurship by Israel Kirzner. And so, but I would start with the Hayek article. It's online also, The Meaning of Competition. And Hayek has always been difficult to read for me. So you have to kind of hang in there. I don't know why it is, but Mises was always clear as a bell to me, but Hayek was always sort of convoluted in his writing, even though usually it takes a little more effort. So, what is competition? I had written a definition down and stuck it on this table, but it's not here. But, the way an Austrian would think of competition is as a dynamic, rivalrous entrepreneurial process. It's an ongoing process. People compete for the patronage of their customers. And that's how Austrians have always thought of competition. It's sort of like as the average layperson thinks of competition. And emphasis is on a process as opposed to the mainstream theory of competition is what you might call an end state theory, and that it's an equilibrium concept. It's a definition of equilibrium. Now, those of you who've taken microeconomics know that there are these conditions, the assumptions behind the competitive model that have been in all the textbooks for generations are many firms, homogeneous products, homogeneous prices, perfect information, and free entry and exit from the industry. And so that's the mainstream model. Those are the assumptions of the mainstream model. And but of course, and this has created a lot of mischief over the years. And the type of mischief it has created is in the form of what Austrian economists and others call the nirvana fallacy. The nirvana fallacy. And so, this model of perfect competition that is sort of the mainstream model, and there are variants of it. There are all kinds of variants of it. It sets up a totally unrealistic, unachievable, utopian ideal of a perfect world. And then the typical procedure would be to look at the real world markets, and I call it not just the nirvana fallacy, but I refer it to as a new term that I coined. Aha-conomics. Maybe you can put an exclamation mark there. You look at it, you set up this totally unachievable, unrealistic, utopian ideal that could never exist on planet Earth, and then you look at a real market and you say, aha, the real market does not stand up to the standards of this totally utopian, unachievable ideal. It has therefore failed. And then the corollary to that, if you're a good economist trained at a place like MIT or Harvard or someplace like that, and under somebody like Paul Krugman, the corollary will be to just assume that naturally government will be omniscient and benevolent and will step in and correct the failures of this market. Okay, and the nirvana fallacy, or why it's a fallacy, is that, of course, everything compared to nirvana is imperfect. And so you really have no theory at all if all you have is some unrealistic ideal that could never be achieved, and you compare reality to that and say, aha, reality falls short of heaven on earth. That's basically what it says. I believe it was Harold Dempsey, the old UCLA economist, who coined the phrase nirvana fallacy. Okay, and so those of you who have taken courses and heard all the theories, various theories of market failure, that's really the basis. The benchmark is perfect competition, but the nirvana fallacy is pervasive all through it. And if you read the Hayek article that I mentioned, you'll get a real good idea of what Hayek meant when he said in that article that in perfect competition there is no competition. All the real competition is just assumed away by the assumptions. Real competition means, for example, experimenting with the size of business firms through mergers and that sort of thing to discover what the most efficient scale of a business enterprise is. No one can know that in advance. That's what Hayek called the pretense of knowledge. The market tells us this. Perfect information. Well, the market reveals information about how to go about minimizing the cost of production, how to market products. Consumers discover what they want and what they like. But this is all assumed to be known in advance in the perfect competition model. So in Hayek's essay, when he said, in perfect competition, there is no competition, he literally was right. So economists wrote off competition when they invented the theory of perfect competition. They decided to abandon the whole idea of studying competition, really. And so it wasn't always like this, though. Around the late 19th, early 20th century, almost all economists anybody who wrote on economics and the whole subject of competition, monopoly, thought of it like the Austrian school thought of it. They thought of competition as a dynamic, rivalrous process of entrepreneurship. And as evidence of that, I once did a research project with a co-author named Jack High, and we published this paper eventually. I'll give you the reference for the graduate students in the audience. It's Jack High and me. It's called Antitrust and Competition. I'm going to abbreviate. Historically considered. It was an economic inquiry way back in July 1988. For those of you who might be interested in these things. And what we did is we surveyed the opinions of all the economists who wrote anything about the whole subject of competition and monopoly around the time the first federal antitrust law was passed in the U.S., the Sherman Antitrust Act. And we know we surveyed the whole population because there was an economist named A.W. Coates who wrote an article in the American Economic Review in 1960. I think it was called the American Economics Club. It was about how in the late 19th century, there were only about maybe a couple of dozen people who actually had professional jobs as economists. So we were able to survey the whole population of the economics profession on this topic. And essentially what they said is that, well, properly understood, competition is a dynamic, rivalrous process. Therefore, all of these mergers that we're seeing, and there was a merger wave going on in American industry, are nothing to worry about. And they were almost unanimously opposed to the whole idea of antitrust regulation as a matter of principle. They thought it was inherently incompatible with competition. Not only did they say, like the Chicago School economists would say, that, well, it's a good law, it was needed at the time, but if it's only run by smart guys like us Chicago School economists, it would be okay. That's essentially the view of the Chicago School. The Austrians, not all Austrians, but most Austrians, I think, would agree with the early 20th century, late 19th century economists who said, no, it's inherently incompatible with real competition and is therefore inherently harmful to consumers. I'll give you some examples from our article. Richard T. Ely, the co-founder of the American Economic Association, wrote that large-scale production is a thing which by no means necessarily signifies monopolized production. You see, this is long before the perfect competition model was accepted, when many firms became the benchmark. And that many firms turned into what is called the structure, conduct, performance paradigm in economics. And what the structure, conduct, performance paradigm meant, and this came about around the 1930s, was that the way to evaluate a market and how competitive it was is based purely on market structure. How many firms dominate sales in an industry, for example. And so rather than studying rivalry, entrepreneurship, innovation, price cutting as means of competition, economists began studying such things as four-firm concentration ratios. That would be the percentage of sales that the four largest firms in an industry had. And if it was a relatively high number, like 60 or 70%, it was pretty much declared to be monopolistic. And it was totally arbitrary. 60% was sort of the arbitrary magic number for many years among antitrust regulators. And so you see, it was totally a different world of understanding of competition once this idea was adopted, that competition needs to be defined in terms of many firms. That wasn't the way Richard T. Ely thought of it. John Bates Clark, whose name is one of the names up here of sort of the Austrians and precursors of the Austrian school, he was the co-founder of the American Economic Association. He wrote in 1888, he said, the notion that industrial combinations would destroy competition should not be accepted. Sort of the founder of the Chicago School, and back in 1919, was a man named Herbert Davenport, who was very, if you read his writings, very similar to an Austrian economist. He said that only a few firms in an industry where there are economies of scale, it does not require the elimination of competition. So they weren't worried about the elimination of competition. And for good reason. These men were observing declining prices for decades. You know, after all, the whole post-Civil War era in the United States was a period of price deflation. So they'd been living through several decades of rapid industrial growth. It was called the Second Industrial Revolution. They saw tremendous expansion in production in all industries. They saw the invention of hundreds of products that never existed before, and they saw prices plummeting year after year after year after year. And why would they think this was monopolistic? They didn't. It was only later economists in the 1930s and 40s who didn't say that they were wrong about what they were observing in the economy of the late 19th century. There was a new theory about what competition meant, and it didn't fit that reality. Simon Patton, the founder of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, said this, that the combination of capital does not cause any economic disadvantage to the community. Combinations are much more efficient than were the small producers whom they displaced. So he was recognizing that through mergers and corporate growth, what they were seeing was economies of scale and lower cost production and lower prices. And yes, they were if they were underpricing smaller competitors, good. It meant it's lower prices. If you think that consumer sovereignty is a valued thing, that we should have an economy that caters to the preferences of consumers, well then striving for lower prices through competition is a good thing. And so this was definitely, these men were all informed, even Richard T. Ely, who was a real leftist. You know, when they founded the American Economic Association, the founding document declared capitalism to be unsafe in practice and unsound in morals. If you go on the web and look up the founding statement of the American Economic Association, that's what it says. And so Ludwig von Mises, of course, refused to join the American Economic Association, and he was labeled as some sort of crackpot or nut for not doing that. But here they are saying capitalism is unsound in morals and unsafe in practice. And then at the time, well, what's the alternative? Well, socialism. And so von Mises refused to be associated with a group of people who he thought were advancing socialism, and for that, you know, he's the oddball in the eyes of his contemporaries at the time. And so let's take a closer look at this many firms assumption that is one of the keystone assumptions of the mainstream model.